You're listening to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, October 10th, 2024. Welcome to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast. I'm Dylan Zavagno, the Adult Services Coordinator at the library. It is an immense honor to share this conversation I had last week with the great novelist Richard Powers. Richard Powers is the author of 14 novels, including recently Orfeo from 2014, The Overstory from 2018, which won the 2019 Pulitzer Prize, Bewilderment from 2021, and now Playground, out just a few weeks ago from W. Norton Co. Richard is also a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship and the National Book Award. He lives in the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains. Richard was here in town for an event at the Chicago Humanities Festival as part of his extensive book tour for Playground. It's funny, on this show we interview authors both local to Chicagoland and national and even international. Well, Richard Powers is somehow both. As you'll hear, he grew up in nearby Evanston and actually has a personal connection to our own Deerfield High School. We share a mutual friend, my former English teacher, Jeff Berger-White. Large portions of Playground also take place in the educational institutions of Chicagoland and Illinois. Todd and Rafi meet in the city as boys, and their friend Ina, who comes from the Pacific Islands, meets them downstate at U of I. In this novel, we also spend time in Galatea, an island in French Polynesia, and under the water with Evelyn, oceanographer, author, and inspiration. Playground is amazing, and this is a profound gift of a conversation about the role of art in us facing all sorts of sea changes, climate crisis, artificial intelligence, aging, illness, love and death, and how we attend to each other. Before we jump in, I just want to say that talking to Richard Powers is a special event for us here at the library, and we want to continue to celebrate this new novel. So I will be leading a book discussion on Playground Thursday, December 5th at 7 p.m. Central. It's hybrid, so you can join us from wherever you're listening or in person at the library. Check the show notes and our website for details and a link to register. Here's my conversation with Richard Powers. Richard Powers, thank you for being here. And I have to start by telling you that I've been reading you my whole adult life, half my life. I entered Jeff Berger-White's senior AP English classroom at Deerfield High School here, just down the road from where I'm speaking. In 2006, I was 17, and I was obsessed with Thomas Pynchon and Vladimir Nabokov. And we were assigned your 2000 novel, Plowing the Dark. And I thought, who is this writer who's using some of these same techniques of my favorite writers, but is talking about computer programming and virtual reality? I didn't know you could do that in a novel. No. And I'll never forget reading about Tamer Martin, the character who's a hostage, and he's using his memories of walking to the Art Institute of Chicago to keep him alive. Yeah. And I was allowed to take the Metro down from Deerfield to go to the Art Institute alone. And reading that made me think what I already knew, which is that those hours could help save me. And then, I have a long question here, I'm sorry. And then, in the summer after graduation, my teacher, Jeff Berger-White, he had an optional discussion group of your second novel, Prisoner's Dilemma. And I think I liked this even more because it was about Disney, which was a childhood obsession, and connecting it to World War II, which my grandfather fought in but didn't talk about. But more importantly, the main character it's centered around, Eddie Hobson, suffering from some kind of illness, and he's a teacher. Well, my dad was a teacher, and he was a principal at Sherwood Elementary in Highland Park, Illinois. And a few years ago, I reread all of your books, Richard Powers, and I saved Prisoner's Dilemma for the end because I remembered it being my favorite. And I kept having this intuition as I was reading about all these scientists and artists and teachers. And I said, I think Richard Powers might have had the same experience I had, where his principal dad would take him to school on Saturdays and you'd be let loose for hours of unstructured play in the public school library.
Right.
And then at the end of Prisoner's Dilemma, which I had saved for last, I read the kids talking about, what are your favorite memories of Dad? And one of them says, he took me into school on a Saturday. Remember how he used to do that? Made you feel a little vulnerable, sneaking behind enemy lines. So you have to tell me, because this novel has so much to do with the cultural life of education in Chicagoland. Did you have the same experience?
Oh my goodness, Dylan, I hardly know where to start with this glorious introduction. It's not every day that a writer gets to talk to his ideal readers. So thank you for that. I have to say, when you started out by saying you were in your late teens and you were obsessed with Pynchon and other writers of that time, that is very much the young man who I was. As for your extraordinary teacher, Jeff Berger-White, I first got a letter from Jeff. Oh gosh, it has to be more than 35 years ago. And I could not believe, the perception of that man, the dedication, the love of literature, and the extraordinary energy and conviction and dedication that he brought to the classroom. And I ended up visiting his classes a few times over the years. I guess I missed your group.
I think you did, yes, but I heard about it.
Yeah, but he's still teaching, and he's still a phenomenon, and he has just raised generations of Deerfield High students to not just love literature, but to take it seriously as a tool with which to navigate life and to grow the self, to meet all the challenges that experience confronts a person with. And so, it's just a thrill to be meeting yet another of his students. They have looked me up over the years because of how often Jeff has taught my novels. But what other novels he has presented and exposed generations of students to. So it's just to get this chance to celebrate him. I'll be seeing him tonight at the event at the Humanities Festival, first time in a long time. So I'm excited about that. As for school principal fathers, yeah, as you will remember, well, now, were you ever in your father's school?
No, because he was in Highland Park, the town over, and I grew up here in Deerfield.
Okay, so you got the good stuff without the traumatic stuff.
Yes.
Because, being a student in the school that your father is principal of adds a whole level of vulnerability and strangeness. But this phenomenon of being let into the school with no one around, it was really, really deeply haunting. I mean, first of all, you got access to all of the amazing, facilities that a school contains and private access. So there's something, extraordinarily special about that. But it's also this sort of weird post-mortem experience of daily life from a level removed. As if everyone is gone except you, or you're seeing it from beyond the pale somehow. And it's a weird, almost like a premonition feeling that you get, visiting these classrooms and knowing that, your friends will be there on Monday, but for now, you just get this strange proprietary private relationship to it. And, the being the son of an educator, being the child of an educator is an incredibly complex experience too, because the people who are led to be teachers or principals have a strong pedagogical streak in them. So, no dinner table conversation or, casual home experiences free from lessons. And I talk about that in Prisoner's Dilemma, that every banal experience is the start of some lesson, and it's just relentless. But you also get that sense of, the role of education in society, and that your parent is somehow doing this not just for you, but as a vocation, as a lifelong commitment to a community. And that I think was a truly fundamental insight for me, and one of the reasons I think I was drawn to writing, because writing also has that that pedagogical and communal element to it.
Yeah. We'll come back to that feeling of feeling like you're post-mortem, I think, in this book, because that's sort of what this book is about, Playground. And because this is a Chicagoland story, of course it's going to be riven by race. So
Right.
Todd Keene, he grows up rich and white in Evanston. It's described as a castle. And eventually he ends up at St. Ignatius College Prep. Where else would he go?
Right.
And he meets there Rafi, a young black boy from the South Side. Instead of behind enemy lines, he calls it enemy territory. And Rafi's application for St. Ignatius, he talks about his favorite place in the world, the library. And you write that he wrote of how he felt the first time he walked into the Taylor Street Library, how everything in creation had its shelf somewhere in that building, and how he could travel anywhere in time and space simply by browsing the aisles. Maybe it's cheating that my favorite spot contains so many others. And then he also has to write a general essay, and he talks about the importance of being sad. And he says, without the ability to feel sad, a person could not be kind or thoughtful, because you wouldn't care or know how anybody feels. Without sadness, you would never learn anything from history. Sadness is the key to loving what you love and to becoming better than you were. A person who never felt sad would be a monster. So Todd notices Rafi, and Rafi's reading all of these strange books. He's reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and the Screw Tape Letters. And how do you say it? Gödel, Escherbach?
Right.
Yeah. Which he says changed his life, and we know influenced Goldbug Variations, of course. And then they go to U of I together. And Rafi is reading books of poetry that are so important to me. He's reading Ashbery's Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror and Amiri Baraka's preface to a 20-volume suicide note. And then this very strange book, The Philosophy of the Common Task, by, how do you say this name? Fyodorov.
Right.
And Rafi has his own reasons. He has his own deep losses that this book seems to cure. But from the beginning, Todd feels, I think it's envy. And I've felt this sometimes. People feel this towards readers, I think. Like, what is he thinking? He has this whole inner life there. And Todd will sort of spend his whole life trying to figure out what Rafi already knows. But Todd exactly misses the mark. He's trying to literalize Rafi's dreams of recuperative loss. Am I onto something there?
Oh my goodness, I could listen to you interpret this book all afternoon. It's delightful. So Rafi is based on a dear friend of mine who I met down in Urbana and who has been a friend for more than a third of a century, is still a friend. We'll be there tonight at the event, so that's quite wonderful too. Yeah, and really, attributes literature to saving his life and to establishing a place for him in the world. And this friendship between Rafi and Todd, it's highly unlikely, despite the fact that they're going to the same high school. But there are motives. They both have similar painful childhoods, which draw them together. They're both outsiders, and they both prize the life of the mind, but their temperaments themselves are very, very different. Todd has a great facility for pattern, for math, for formal systems. Rafi's facility is for words, for emotional intelligence, for introspection. And I think you're right. I think part of the push-pull friendship, the pull is most literally exemplified by board games. They discover a common passion for chess and later for Go, and they're constantly trying to beat each other. So it's a friendship based on competition, and as is my friendship with my friend to some extent. That kind of sense of being drawn together by wanting to best each other. But the push comes, I think, from, as you say, a strange suspicion or jealousy or anxiety about the fact that the way the other person enters most deeply into the world is locked off to you, is a little bit foreclosed to you because your mind is just a bit different. And, Todd and Rafi are constantly battling over whether the programming approach to life or whether the literary analysis approach to life is the most powerful and the most profound, and which one ultimately will be able to have the last word over the other. And so much of the book is based around that tension between two ways of knowing the world, and which one is the most powerful for describing the other. And in a strange way, not to be too self-psychoanalytic, but this friendship between these two men who know the world in such different ways was, vicarious pleasure for me to recreate and to compose, because it is in many ways a kind of reification of a tension inside me.
Yeah.
That I myself have struggled throughout my whole life with two very different kinds of attractions, Todd's way of knowing the world and Rafi's way of knowing the world. And their battle is my battle to some extent. So here I am, 40 years on, 14 novels in, still trying to answer this question about, what part of Richard Powers should be able to have the final say over, what other part. And in that regard, this book was a real recreation of my own, psychic development.
Wow. Well, I kept thinking about Peter Els, the composer in Orfeo, and at one point he says he hears some music. This is early in the book, and he says, once you've loved like that, like loved this piece of music, the only safe haven is resentment. And I think this is a danger for all of us encountering beauty, right? You start to resent it, and there's, to me, nothing more beautiful than a life dedicated to literature. But sometimes reading this book and I read it 4 times. And I would have this feeling of like the duck and rabbit optical illusion.
Mhm. Mm.
Or I also thought of like a weird AI image where there's like a sixth finger, where sometimes I would feel so moved by, Todd is suffering with Lewy body dementia. He's trying to write down his memories and really have them teach him something. But then other times it's the illusion switches and you go, what a jerk that he's just stealing everything from Rafi, and just for all of his suffering, he's using his tech empire to like soothe himself. And there's this like double thing happening. And this must have been intentional that you wanted us to feel this same way about everything we were reading.
Did you feel it with Rafi as well?
By the time I reread it, I felt it with some of the scenes of Rafi.
Yeah, because I know, I've heard from other readers who describe that same ambivalence that you described with regard to Todd's character. This guy's just a Silicon Valley tech bro. I should hate him, but I can't, because he's so messed up. He's so vulnerable. He's trying so hard to justify his existence, and he loves his friend. Despite being a complete screw up with regard to that friendship. And really not understanding this guy who's probably the closest guy in his life, failing to have a basic fundamental understanding of the differences between the two of them. But I know that readers have also felt complex feelings toward Rafi. They could say on the one hand, why is he so aggressive? Why is he so prickly? And so, some people have even said he's like a narcissist. And then you keep watching and you keep thinking about his circumstances, and you keep seeing the subtle ways that he's bouncing off of his friend and trying to make a space for himself. And you say, actually, he's doing a quite noble thing and quite an amazing act of redemption and recuperation.
Well, maybe it's just because I'm a librarian that, of course, I identify with Rafi. But
anyone who loves books can be forgiven everything. Yeah.
Let's have you read a section on page 126, because I think this. I thought this was just a key passage of the novel where we see this divergence happening in real time.
Good. Rafi and I bonded over having skipped a grade and being largely self-taught. We bonded over being the sons of fucked up fathers and erratic mothers who couldn't cope with their mates. We shared a contempt for the hierarchies of prestige and coolness that ran the school. And neither of us saw our outcast state as anything but a massive asset in the life ahead. We were both nuts about Tolkien and Star Wars and Ursula Le Guin. But even with all that in common, the only way the two of us would ever have spent so much time together was over a chessboard. Something turbulent was warring inside him, a darker, more desperate game. I sensed it, but didn't understand it. He didn't bother hiding it from me, but he wasn't about to share. The two of us weren't going to visit the place together. One afternoon, I surprised him in the library with a copy of a book called The Master and Margarita. The book wasn't on any syllabus in that school. He tapped the spooky cover. They're keeping the good shit from us, brother. Too dangerous. A few weeks later, in humanities class, as Father Kelly was declaiming E. E. Cummings' Somewhere I Have Never Traveled, Gladly Beyond, for the entire numbed class, I turned around to roll my eyes at Rafi in the row behind me. His eyes were wet, and he was mouthing along with the words. He saw that I saw that he was crying, but his murderous gaze told me that if I so much as alluded to this ever, he would cut me dead.
Now, it's not, the text of the poem isn't in the book, but the E. Cummings poem, I'm just going to read a section of it here. Or if your wish be to close me, I and my life will shut very beautifully, suddenly, as when the heart of this flower imagines the snow carefully everywhere descending. Nothing which we are to perceive in this world equals the power of your intense fragility, whose treasure compels me with the color of its countries, rendering death and forever with each breathing. So, Richard, I have to ask you about snow and fragility. I am so fascinated by this. So Todd is writing out his memories of their time at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. And this memory appears twice where, do you say Ina or Ina? How do you pronounce it?
Ina.
Ina.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Ina, she comes from the Pacific Islands to go to school at U of I. And she forms sort of the third point in this love triangle. And the three of them go to see The Tempest. And she's so overwhelmed at one point that she has to leave. Todd, as usual, does not get it.
Right.
And she goes outside, and it's snowing. And she says, how could you not tell me about snow, and how could life exist in this place with snow? And you describe it as falling like eggshell. Well, we know from the opening of the book that Te Aurora, the Polynesian god, has, to create the world, burst out of his shell, and he's an artist, so he uses the eggshell as the material of the earth. And if we know the E. Cummings poem, and we know snow carefully everywhere descending, and then we read in the other narrative, Evelyn, this oceanographer, she speaks French, so she knows her Rimbaud, right. And she knows the drunken boat.
Right.
And Rimbaud talks about the dazzled snow, the little specks floating through the ocean, and she's diving, and she says, I think this is the question every character is asking in the book, right? How did this poet know? How did the poet know? And it gets tangled up with this question of how fragile is it? And I don't know what the it is. Is it life? Is it creativity?
Well, it's also presence. It's also simply seeing and knowing and attending. That's what's so fragile.
Wow.
I have to say, at this point, I'd rather hear you describe the book than me. It's so lovely to see your connections. Going back to this initial passage that you had me read, I don't know if Jeff Berger-White had your group read The Master and Margarita.
He did, yeah.
Yeah,
and I just taught it here at the library last year.
Oh, right. But that's in here as a kind of Easter egg for Jeff, because he got me to read that book, and because of his enthusiasm in teaching it. So that's on the table too, as far as being present and attending and witnessing to someone seeing something in the ephemeral, fragile, very brief moment of experience that we're given here, on a very fragile and ephemeral planet. But I was also noticing the way that this passage works, and in Todd we have a doubly unreliable first person narrator.
Right.
someone who is saying, let me tell you about my friend Rafi. And of course, in doing so, reveals all kinds of things about his own capacities and incapacities that he may not be aware of himself. So when he says about Rafi, something turbulent was warring inside him, a darker, more desperate game, he doesn't realize that he's pointing the finger at himself by
right.
Projecting it onto his friend. And certainly the case for Rafi, but we, the readers, see that what it is that so desperately connects these boys. But this breadcrumb trail from Cummings to an islander's first glimpse of snow to Rimbaud, that's, to me, one of the most mysterious aspects of making a book.
Yeah.
Because often I don't see the breadcrumb trail myself until a future revision, several reworkings down the way. And sometimes I see that I've started a breadcrumb trail and I can actually enhance it and add more points, more nodes in revision. But so much of it is unconscious, and so much of it is fostered later on by a consciousness that's just catching up with the unconscious. But for me, the great pleasure of reading is finding those allusions, finding those associations, just watching, them weave through a plot. You may be turning the pages to find out what happens, but viscerally, as you turn the pages, the thing that's really lighting up all the different areas in your brain is this realization that this book is in conversation with centuries of other people writing other things.
Yeah. So the question, it turns just not how does the poet know? Well, he has that question himself, but also how does the reader know?
Right.
And I just, once again, there's an offstage quotation because Todd alludes to what's so moving to Ina about the Tempest. And Ina tells us that her people's history has been wiped out and she can only know it as a reader of books. And the thing that moves her so much is Caliban's speech. Can I read Caliban's speech to you?
Yep.
Be not afeard. The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 tangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometime voices that, if I then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again. And then, in dreaming, the clouds methought would open and show riches ready to drop upon me, that, when I waked, I cried again to dream. Now, in Galatea 2.2, your 1995 novel, where they're trying to teach an AI to complete a literature exam, they feed the version of the AI known as A near the end of the book, they feed it The Tempest. And it gives a pretty good post-colonial reading, but it says there's no transcendence. But then you write that it conceded how these words are spoken by a monster who isn't supposed to be able to say anything that beautiful, let alone say at all. And I think this book is trying to make us not afraid of monsters, whether that's Todd or the tech company he's created, but I'm still very scared of that.
Well, sure. This book is definitely in conversation with that 30-year-old novel Galatea, which, interestingly, in retrospect, may have been one of the very first literary predictions of large language models. And when I wrote that book as a young man, it was purely science fiction and a fable. And now, a third of a century later, is literal truth. I mean, the training of Helen in that book is exactly corresponding to the training of Chat GPT-4.
You
It's
read
only
it
a
now
matter
and you say, how did the poet know, right? How did Richard Powers know?
yeah. But, in that regard, too, it's also an old man of 67 in conversation with a young man of 35.
Yeah.
And, looking back at the young man's hopes and fears and saying, I too am here at the end of the day with my hopes and fears, which will be alien to you, but which are also sympathetic or corresponding or somehow familiar. I don't think we can ever not be afraid of the monsters that we're making,
Yeah.
but we have to maintain the self-possession that will continue the act of creating them and making them, tilting their affordances toward the world that we want to live in. So another big intertext. I mean, you are absolutely right to put your finger on the tempest, which emerges 5 or 6 more
Yes.
times in different forms throughout the book, and ultimately, not only when Eveline quotes the famous Full Fathom 5, to talk about the transformation that happens to things underwater, but even the end of the book in which I hope this doesn't give anything away, but in which Caliban actually becomes Prospero, and our little life, which is rounded with a sleep, makes the reader realize that they've been reading a very different kind of book than they think they've been reading. So The Tempest is all over this, but there are a couple of other books that are also very, very prominent, and one is a strange philosophical work from a couple of decades ago called Finite and Infinite Games by James P. Carse. And in that book, Carse kind of builds the entire philosophical reflection around distinguishing between two kinds of games that we play in our lives: the finite game, which we play to win, and the infinite game, whose purpose is to figure out how to continue to play. And what I am trying to do, I think, in so many of my books, but certainly in Playground, is to tilt culture away from the finite game of control and mastery and individualism and commodity-mediated meaning that we are so good at, so tragically good at, to this infinite game of presence and attention and art and poetry, and to see that all of these tools that we have that have tremendous affordances for good and for evil should not be played as finite games. We need to use them to find out how to continue to live on this fragile earth that we have put so much pressure on.
So then it seems like part of your method for getting us to play infinite games is to, in some ways, alienate us. So the way this book has been talked about, Playground, is some people say, oh, it's the Overstory, but for the oceans. And like if you were tree blind before and you read the Overstory and now you see trees in a new way, now you're going to see oceans in a new way. It's not that that's not there in this book, but it's, the thing about the Overstory is that I would have this sensation. Wait, I have your stack of books here. I would have the sensation holding the book that I was reading the biography of the trees that were pulped to make this physical object, right? That metafictional or meta-reality experience I was having. And reading this novel, I had this very disturbing feeling that my very consciousness, I was like a tree. My consciousness was being pulped into making AI. And of course, this very conversation is going to be uploaded online and it will be trawled. That's an ocean word too, right?
Mhm.
But it just, you know, I just had this very strange feeling that you were pushing me into a new world.
Yes, I I I don't mind people seeing the correspondences between Overstory and Playground. They are in very close
Sure.
conversation with each other, and I've begun to say that they are the outer movements of a three-movement concerto about
Yeah.
human exceptionalism, with a very different kind of book, Bewilderment, in the middle between the two of them.
Oh,
Um,
Richard, I have to jump in because my other theory is you could not have written those three movements, these last three books, without
mm,
writing Orfeo first.
mm,
Because all over Orfeo, John Cage is telling us if you want to order creation around, that's your problem, not
mm.
mine. And then he says, what is the purpose of writing music? A purposeful purposelessness or a purposeless play. It's
Yeah.
almost like you needed this study of John Cage and this, avant-garde figure to open that door into the non-human.
Gosh, Dylan, I will never have such a satisfying experience with an interviewer again. Thank you for opening all these doors and drawing all these connections and having freshly read so many of these books, which are talking to each other. But also thank you for putting your finger on one of the principal tools for making this game work, which is alienation. And
Yeah.
it sounds like a negative thing. Why would I want to be alienated? Um, and maybe a less harsh word would be estrangement. And I know,
Mm-hmm.
Bertolt Brecht, for instance, is famous for talking about the estrangement effect and the way in which art can turn the familiar into something magical and animated and enchanted again. But for that, it requires some technique or some mechanism for making us realize that what we think is familiar is not, and that our knowledge for encapsulating or identifying or naming that thing is insufficient and it has to be taken away. And we have to come at that familiar thing from a strange angle again. And this can happen in all kinds of different ways. I mean,
Yeah.
tiny little sentence level estrangements or
Right.
alienations. For instance, at one point, uh, Rafi's uh, childhood fascinations are being described, and uh, it the description says he became obsessed with Danish colored plastic
Yes,
blocks.
yes, yes. I noticed this. Yes, yes.
Yeah, and you could very easily have said he fell in love with Legos,
Right, right.
but if you said he fell in love with Legos, the reader would say, "Oh, I know Legos, and I've got a category for that, and I'll just sort of slot that into my own understanding of who this guy is and what these things meant to him." But if you try to find a description that's just a little off or a little bit indirect, then the reader has to start again and say, well, what were those things and how did I feel the first time that I saw them, before I knew their name, before I relegated them to
Yeah.
the already defined. So you can do it at the sentence level. There's a similar one in Todd's childhood where he's talking about this toy where you press the colored lights and the machine
Yes.
gives you a sequence of colored lights, and you have to recreate that. And everybody who's used one will say, "Oh, I remember that," and they
Right. But
might
see,
have
I
to
had to look it
struggle.
up. I remembered
Oh,
that and I
right,
said,
because you're
what
too
is the
young.
name of that? I had
Yeah,
played it as a kid, but I had to Google it. And it's like,
right.
it's a weird thing because everything is being folded back into any
Hmm.
avant-garde is being folded back into the culture. So I went right to Google to tell me
Right,
and
right.
not be estranged anymore.
Well, and actually, so I play a little game with that too, because as Todd is telling us this, he is suffering from Lewy body dementia, and he is racing the clock in a way against his own cognitive decline. But the ending of that section where he describes these childhood toys that set him on the path to becoming a programmer and to making his own immense contribution to the transformation, the estrangement, the alienation of the world through his own new inventions, you kind of understand indirectly that he can't remember the name of this toy either. And at the end of that passage, he says, thankfully, I have this tiny little magic black monolith in my pocket where with a few keystrokes, I can have it tell me what that thing was called.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. There's so many places I want to go with this, but, well, I did want to ask about a writer I know is important to you, Lewis Thomas, because you've talked about Bewilderment, the title of the novel Before Playground, as coming from his essay on matters of doubt. And when he connects humanities and scientists, they both have this shared sense of bewilderment. But I really kept thinking while reading this book, Playground, about the essay after that in this book, Late Night Thoughts on Listening to Mahler's Ninth Symphony. And it's the last essay in the book. And you have Lewis Thomas, who I actually think he was 67 at the time he wrote this book, or maybe wrote this essay. And, I'm 35 now. We were saying that. But he says he can't listen to Mahler's Ninth anymore without seeing death everywhere because of the world of the atomic bomb. And he's talking about having to listen to newscasters saying, well, we can afford to lose a few million here if the Russians fire a bomb, but we can't afford to lose this, and just kind of very sanguine about, this massive death. In the very last paragraph, he says, if I were 16 or 17 years old and had to listen to that or read things like that, I would want to give up listening and reading. I would begin thinking up new kinds of sounds, different from any music heard before, and I would be twisting and turning to rid myself of human language. And this was the early 80s. I always think of Lewis Thomas like going to a punk show or a Sonic Youth concert or something, and appreciating, well, of course these young kids are making this music that's so alien because that responds to the world. And at one point, I guess this is just continuing the question about how avant-garde these novels are, because at one point Todd is pulled before Congress and they say, well, didn't you call yourself a creative destroyer? And he says, no, we're disruptors now. Well, that's what, the avant-garde used to say. But I really felt like this novel was trying to not just alienate me, but destroy me, or like prepare me for a world where I would have to, because I was so moved by it, but then I have to identify with this machine creation. And it's very hard for me as a reader to want to do that. It really scares me.
As it should. Thomas was writing out of a moment where the threat of mutually assured destruction was on everyone's, in everyone's immediate field of view. And we are living at a moment that is, by some measures, as precarious, because we are releasing into the world technologies that have inconceivable power of leverage. And, even those people who are working on the forefront of these frontier artificial intelligence models are themselves frightened. And divide dramatically in their predictions of how disruptive these technologies are going to be. And when the experts say there may be somewhere between 30 and 50% unemployment within 5 to 10 years, how can society possibly survive that? It is time to be afraid, but it is absolutely essential that fear becomes something productive, right, something artistic, and something spiritual. And, Thomas knew that formula. He knew that formula, and so do the other essayists and scientists whose work Playground alludes to. Rachel Carson was writing at a moment where people were getting their first glimpse of the ways in which science and technology, the offsprings of technology, might create a kind of annihilation that we had never seen. And, Silent Spring was a message about the catastrophe that our technologies was unleashing. But Carson had the formula, and Lauren Isley had the formula. And the formula is, yes, our science is creating these monsters with tremendous affordances, hugely powerful and leverageable ability to do both good and harm. So how are we expected to live? How are we expected to make a lasting home on this place, this planet, whose existence, whose balance we are throwing into chaos? And I think the answer is by knowing that only bringing together science and spirituality, the empirical power, the power of empiricism, and the power of poetry, the power of art, to represent us in the world, only by seeing those two processes, not as being at odds with each other, but as being inextricably connected, are we going to have even a remote chance of sticking around.
And even Todd seems to learn that despite himself almost. I mean, I wondered if you were thinking about the end of art and proving almost with this book that even if you had gone in the direction of Todd, or if you had lived or tried to see yourself post-mortem, that this book would prove that narrative would still exist. The manta rays would still play, right? You can't escape it. That magic of literary attention is always going to be there.
That's absolutely, absolutely right. And that the children of mankind, these monsters that we're making, if we make them right, they will be making art with us. And, again, it's a challenging book to talk about because there's so much to give away. It's so easy to kind of blow the ending. But the friendship goes wrong.
Yeah.
The friendship between technology and literature goes wrong. And the boys fall out and they lose each other. But then they find each other again in a very strange and unexpected way. And it's through Caliban. It's through the monster.
Yeah.
And I can't say anything more than that, but boy, you're reading, a reading that has fear, a reading that has hope, a reading that keeps its eyes open to, all of the potential disasters that we've set in motion, but a reading that also says, like with Tennyson, though much is taken, much abides. That to me is the ideal reading. The oceans are still here,
right?
No matter what we've already done to them, and it's our job to come back to them, to make this place home again.
But I guess what is so both moving and challenging to me is that I began to think of you like Prospero abjuring his rough magic and never writing again because the AI will write for you.
Well, whatever the AI writes, remember what it's been trained on. And if it estranges us and alienates us, and therefore represents us, reawakens us to all the things that that are in its training set, then it will be doing art. My personal feeling is that whatever art our machines become capable of doing is going to just reawaken our own artistic potentials, and this dialogue is going to go on and on and on.
Yeah.
And that everything that we've done that seemingly takes away from the creative impulse only adds to it. Socrates had a real anxiety about writing. That was going to destroy our memory and destabilize society. And people in the early, the early and middle 19th century were saying, well, photography is going to destroy the visual arts. And it did nothing but inject the visual arts with whole new kinds of urgencies and inventions and energies. So everything that we make makes us more capable of making. And remember, everything that we make came out of us. Yeah. And if the machine is telling good stories, it's because we've trained it on good stories.
Well, I couldn't imagine a better place to end than that, but I think I want to just ask you the naive question, which some literary magazines ask you now to disclose. Did you use AI in the creation of this book?
I did something really amazing and mind-blowing to me. When I had the stable final draft that I gave to my publishers, and when it came back as a PDF for me to proofread, I took that PDF and I uploaded it to ChatGPT-4. And I asked ChatGPT-4, what do you think of this? And had a conversation with it about my book. And it was like talking to a very smart Deerfield High School student, but it only took 3 seconds for it to read the book and about 5 seconds to respond to the book. And I would say, tell me, did you see anything in the book, any interesting treatments of irony? Can you give me some good examples of irony in the book? And all of a sudden there were, 7 examples of irony that it had found, some of which I hadn't even considered myself. Some of them which, were stronger than others. Some of them were off the wall. And then I said, what do you think Powers is saying about AI?
Yeah.
And then ChatGPT, took a breath and just started pouring out words, I think he's taking he's trying to walk a tightrope here. I think he's saying these, powerful possibilities exist in these new technologies, but I think he's also saying these terrible things are just under the hood, and that we're not ready, and that no one knows what's coming, and which side of these affordances is going to win out. And then I said, so what do you think? And ChatGPT-4 said something like, I think we need to be careful.
Wow. I mean, my fear is that AI is already influencing us culturally to speak well of it.
I think every technology that we've ever made has changed our brains and made us into different creatures. And so much of this book is about postmorteming that, going back and saying, who were we before we had these things? And we need to keep doing that, because to know who we are, we also have to know the way we came. And to know who we will be next, we need to be very, very present and attentive to who we are at this moment.
Richard, thank you so much for your time and for just your incredible body of work. It means a lot to me.
Dylan, it was a great pleasure. Thanks for your brilliant insights and questions.
Thank you. This is a dream come true, so I really, really appreciate it.
I have to say, one of the best interviews I've ever had. I just can't. I'm so grateful to your questions and to your both your intellectual ingenuity and your deep emotional engagement to it. So
thank you.
You can check out books by Richard Powers here at the library, including in our podcast collection where we have books by all of our past podcast guests. Richard's website is richardpowers.net. I hope you'll join us for our book discussion on Playground, either here at the library or on Zoom, December 5th, 7 p.m. Central. Again, there will be a link to register in our show notes and on our website. A huge thank you to Richard for his time, as well as to Elizabeth at WW Norton, and especially to my teacher, Jeff Berger-White. He's retiring at the end of this year. And actually, let me play the real ending of my talk with Richard Powers.
Intellectual ingenuity and your deep emotional engagement to it, So
thank you. I really feel I learned it from Jeff, but well, I appreciate that very deeply.
You trained at the foot of the master. So.
Jeff, thank you for opening the door and teaching me that Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. And that's our show. Thank you for listening to our 65th interview episode. Comments and feedback are always welcome and can be sent to podcast@deerfieldlibrary.org. And we always appreciate a review and rating. Go to deerfieldlibrary.org/podcast to learn more about our show and find links to subscribe. You can also follow the library on all social media channels or check out our YouTube channel. Links are on our website and in the show notes. We'll be back soon. Thanks for listening.